Welcome back to the channel. In today's tutorial, we're going to paint a festive loose watercolor wreath using fun fall colors and simple techniques. I'll share the entire process step by step so you can follow along with me. Let's get started. If you're new to my channel, I always link all of my specific supplies down below in the description box, so if you're ever curious what brushes, paint, and paper I'm using in the video, be sure to check that out. Alright, so I'm going to start by taking my sheet of paper. This is 100% cotton cold press paper, and we're going to outline a circle for your wreath. You can use anything you want to make this circle. Sometimes I use something like a roll of masking tape. Since this sheet of paper is a little bit larger, I used the bottom side of a bowl. I just flipped it upside down and then traced around it. And make sure your outline isn't too dark. So I traced mine and then I gently rolled over it with a kneaded eraser so that I can still see where that line is, but those pencil marks aren't going to show through my paint. Now when I paint wreaths, especially floral ones, I like to start by placing my largest elements first, and I kind of space them out. So I'm going to start in kind of this bottom left area, and we're going to start with my largest element, which will be the big blooming rose. So I've loaded up my brush. This is a size 5 round brush, and I loaded it up with a mixture of Quin Sienna and Quin Lake. It creates a really beautiful, vibrant red. And we're going to start by painting the rose. Now up at the top, I'll link some of my favorite rose tutorials. I have quite a few, so I'm not going to go too in-depth on how to paint a rose because I do have so many tutorials already on that, but just as a refresher, I start by using the tip of my brush and I paint these little C curves. And they're called C curves because they're in the shape of a letter C. I'm leaving some white space in between and working my way around this rose, creating these dainty little C curves. They're not all the same size, and you can see I'm leaving a little bit of white space in between there. Now while it's still wet, I'll rinse off my brush so I have clean water, and I'm going to gently feather these strokes out. And remember, when you're painting roses, you always want to start with darker pigment in the middle, and then gradually get lighter and lighter. So that's why I'm rinsing off the pigment so that I can have these really light outer petals. And I'm also getting thicker as I work towards those outer edges, keeping white space in mind. If you don't have that white space, then you're going to end up with a blob of color, but that white space is really what helps to define your petals. Now we are painting in the loose style, so while these are still wet, I'm going to go back in and tap in some more of the dark pigment so you can see that gently bleeding out into the petals. One of my favorite parts of loose style painting. You can see that color gently creeping out. So that's looking good. So now I'm going to add my outer petals. I really want this rose to have that big blooming effect. So I'm going to start pulling out petals. So instead of C curves, I'll start with the tip of my brush and create a big fluffy petal that's kind of coming outwards instead of to the side. Just like that. So let's add a few more of them. Some of them will start to kind of curve upwards around that outer edge. And I'm just using these quick strokes. I'm not worrying about making the perfect petals. This is all very loose. So don't be afraid to work quickly and don't overthink it as you add these. So you can see these ones are pulling straight out, and then as I approach the top of the rose, I'm kind of curving them upwards. Once again, because we're painting loose style, while they're still wet, I go back in and gently tap some more pigment so that it can bleed out. Now I'm going to do a similar rose down here at the very bottom, and I want this one to be slightly more purpley tone, so I'll still use that same mixture of Quin Sienna and Quin Lake, but ratio wise I'm going to have some more Quin Lake to give it that purpley hue. So like I mentioned, when I start out on a wreath, I like to kind of place those big elements first, but I leave plenty of space in between them, and that way I can then work to my smaller elements and fill in those gaps. So let's do another one of these roses, starting with my dark pigment and using the very tip of my brush to create these C curves. They're very wispy and very dainty. Let's start with that and then rinse off your brush so you have very clean water, and that way you can start gently outlining these strokes and feathering it out to get those very beautiful bleeds always working dark to light, where your darker strokes are in the very center of the rose and your lighter strokes are in the outer edges. Making sure to leave that white space as you go. Again, be sure to check out my other rose tutorials if you're struggling with your roses. I do have a lot of tutorials that go more in depth into the rose painting process than what I'm doing now. We have a lot of painting to get to in this wreath, so I'm not going too in depth into the process. But like I said, I do have several other rose tutorials that you can check out. I know roses can sometimes be really tricky to paint, so if you're struggling with it, you can get a lot of great practice in those tutorials. So just like the other one, I'm going to add my skirting petals. These first ones I'm pulling straight out. So instead of C curves, we're creating petals that are going outwards. And then we'll add a few more. And as I paint these skirting petals, I start to kind of curve them upwards. So they're not all going directly out. They're kind of curving up around that circular shape of the rose. Pulling out these strokes, remember you don't have to make perfect petals as you do this. It's very loose style, so you can have fun and let those colors bleed and bloom. Okay, so our two main roses are done. We are going to add a few more roses, but not in this same color. And since I have a good amount of this color already mixed up in my palette and in my brush, I'm going to move on to a different type of flower, but using the same color. So again, leaving a little bit of white space here so that we have plenty of room to add our other elements. And here I'm going to add a basic loose watercolor flower. For this flower, I don't want it to be perfectly straight on. I want to have a little bit of a side view perspective. So I'll start with the tip of my brush and create these very wispy little inner strokes. They're just little marks on the paper. They're not perfect petals or anything like that, but they are very pigmented. So I'll rinse off my brush and pull from that color to create my petals. So I have clean water in my brush, and all I'm doing is pulling out that color that we already placed in those initial strokes to create these flower petals. So you can see it's darker value in the center where we placed the initial strokes, and then I'm just loosely pulling out some of that color to create these petals. While it's still wet, I want to take advantage of that and get some beautiful blooms of color, so I'll go back in and tap in a little more color. And then I want to have a bottom petal, but instead of pulling out like I have for these top ones, I want it to be a little bit more flat, which will help to give it a different perspective. So I'm creating a flat stroke. We're always starting very pigmented in the center, and then to create the actual petals, I'm rinsing off my brush and using clean water to paint in those petals. Again, while it's still wet, you can take some of that darker pigment and gently tap it into the center. I don't want it to flood the petals, I just want it to gently create a beautiful bloom right there at the base of the petal. Okay, so those are all of the primary reddish purpley flowers. So now we can move on to some of the primary orangey yellow flowers. So we're going to do another rose right up here at the top, slightly to the right. Again, when you're working with floral compositions, you never want to have things that look too symmetrical. You don't want to have things directly across from each other. So I don't want to have a big flower right here and one directly beneath it. I want to kind of offset them so that it doesn't look too perfect or uniform. So I'm going to mix up some of this orange, it's cadmium yellow deep, with a little bit of quin sienna. Again, all these colors are linked down below if you want to check them out, but it'll be the same process. I have a lot of pigment to start, and I'm just creating these very dainty little C strokes. I have a lot of pigment so that when I feather it out, that color will automatically expand out into the petals. Make sure to keep white space in mind as you do this. Rinse off your brush, and then gently line those strokes and feather out the petals. So you can see darker value in the very center of the rose where it's tighter, the petals are more closed up, and then you're getting lighter towards the outer edges where those petals are nice and big and fluffy, and they're getting hit by a lot of light. Same as we did with the other roses, I'll start adding a few skirting petals, starting by pulling down. So I add a little bit of color there and then press my brush down on the paper to create those nice big outer petals. So let's add some more here, always leaving a little bit of white space so your flower doesn't turn into a blob of color. That is one of the most frustrating things when you're painting roses, is if you don't leave enough white space. Things just look a little bit too messy and blobby, and you don't have that separation to really define the petals. So I'm just going to add a few here and then go back in and tap in some more of that dark value. And because it's still wet, it's gently bleeding out into the rest of the flower. So let me zoom you out so you can get a better sense of how the wreath looks overall. Okay, so now you can start to see where those primary elements are. I want to add a couple more of these yellow ones. I want it to be nice and balanced, so we will have quite a few yellows in between the red ones. We'll have some red in between the yellow, but for now, I like to usually work in one color at a time, just because that's the color that's already activated on my palette. That's the color that's already in my brush. So we have this primary yellow here, and now I'm going to do a basic 6-petal flower right around here, so kind of in between these two roses. If you're familiar with my other flower tutorials, you know this technique already. I start by adding these very pigmented marks in the center of the flower, and these are all going to be similar petals. So I rinse off my brush and pull out that color to create a very basic petal shape. So I'm only using that color that we already placed down in the very center of the flower, so that when I pull out these petals, I'm using clean water, but because those initial strokes were so pigmented, that color expands out into each petal. It follows the water into the petal. So to add some contrast to this flower, I will go back in and add some of this red color into the center, but because it's still wet right now, I don't want that color to mix too much, so I'm going to go ahead and let this dry, and then we'll add those center marks. Now, one final area that I want to have this orangey yellow color is right around here, and I'm just going to do a very basic rose. I'm not going to add the outer skirting petals. It's basically just going to be the first few steps of the roses we've been painting. So same as we've done, starting with those dark pigmented C-strokes, leaving some white space, and using clean water to soften out those edges and create a very basic rose. Again, no skirting petals on this one. I'm just using the C curves, leaving white space, and working my way from dark petals in the very center and light petals for the outer edge. While it's still wet, I'll go back in with that dark value to deepen some of those inner edges of the petals. Okay, so that's going to be it for the main big elements. We are going to add a lot more flowers and a lot of greenery and fillers, but for now, that kind of sets the stage for how the shape is and where we're going to have that white space to fill in with the rest of the elements. So now we want to infuse some of that yellowy orange down here at the bottom. But these are going to be much smaller flowers, and you can really tailor these to how you like to paint flowers or how you want your overall wreath to look. So this one that I'm doing will be very similar to this flower we just did up here, but much smaller. So starting by adding these tiny little dots, using the tip of my brush, rinsing it off, and then pulling out petals, but making sure they're very small and dainty. So I'm keeping my strokes very small and pulling out these almond-shaped petals. So keeping it very simple, very dainty. It's a basic flower just like this. And again, like I mentioned with this one, we will be adding some more color to help bring it to life and add some contrast. But for now, I just want to let it dry, and then we'll go ahead and do that. Using that same color, let's go ahead and add a couple more of these. I also want to break up this color with some of the yellow. So I'll do the same thing right here, tapping in those very pigmented center dots, rinsing off my brush, and pulling out some basic petals. So you have a lot of room for creativity here. You can add any type of flower you like. If you want to add more roses, by all means add more roses. If you want to throw in some different types of flowers, you can absolutely do that. I'm just keeping things pretty simple for the sake of this tutorial. While we have this yellow on our brush, let's add a few more. I'm going to do another teeny tiny one right next to this big rose. Adding in my dots, I'm going to make this one a little bit more of an oval shape to give it some different perspective. So these top petals will be standard. I'm pulling them out using quick expressive strokes. I'm not worrying about making perfect petals. And then again, that bottom petal will be kind of horizontal. And that just makes it look a little bit different from the straight on perspective like this one. Let's go ahead and add one final yellow guy right next to this orange rose. So for the yellow, I'm just using Cadmium Yellow Deep. I'm not adding any of the Quin Sienna, so it's much more of a yellow tone like this instead of an orangey tone like this. But if you have another color palette that you want to work with, this doesn't just have to be fall colors. It's basically just a regular floral wreath, but using fall colors. But if you have other colors of your own, you're more than welcome to use them. Now to help give these flowers a little bit more contrast and pop, I'm going to go back in and darken the very center with that red mixture, which is Quin Sienna and Quin Lake. I'm just going to use a little bit, and only on the tip of my brush, I'm gently tapping it into the center and creating these little tiny dots. It's nothing crazy, but even having a little bit of contrast like that helps it look more elevated. So this one's a little dull and basic, and adding that contrast there helps it pop. So I'm adding these tiny wispy little strokes, nothing too crazy. You can add some little dainty lines, but I'm only using the tip of my brush. I don't want it to become a red or purple flower. I just want that color to be concentrated in the very, very center. And finally, let's do the same thing on this final little guy right here. Now, if you want to have those colors bleed and blend together, you can do this part while it's still wet. I just wanted to have the details a little bit sharper and cleaner. So at this point, our wreath is starting to fill up. We still have some white gaps, so I'm going to go back to my red mixture and I'll add a few more of these same types of flowers. So first I'll do one here. Again, you can create any types of flowers you want. I'm just kind of winging it, but I always use the same techniques. So starting with those center strokes that are very pigmented, keeping it nice and small, rinsing off my brush and pulling out these petals. I'm keeping these flowers nice and small because I don't want them to compete with those primary flowers that we started with. I just want them to be complementary. So keeping them very dainty and small and adding in some very loose petals. They're not perfect by any means, they're very loose, a kind of scribbly almost. Let's do another small guy right here. I brought you in a bit closer so you can see this process better, but I start with the very pigmented strokes and add some wispy marks. Rinse off my brush so I have clean water here. I use the tip of my brush and pull out and create almond-shaped petals. So you're getting a lot of great practice with these flower techniques. I try to make my petals so they're not all the exact same shape and size. Sometimes I add these little wispy strokes like this to give them a little more character. And then I add the final horizontal petal down at the bottom. So we are getting close here. I'm going to add a few more little flowers. I don't want to stuff the entire wreath with flowers yet because I do want some room to add leaves and foliage, but I do want to add a little bit more. So just go ahead and add a couple more little flowers if you have any big white gaps. Alright, so now all of the flowers are in place. You can see we have a good amount. We have some big elements, we have smaller ones, we have some in between, and we still have some empty white space to add our fillers and our foliage. Now for my leaves, if you've taken any of my other tutorials or classes, you know I normally like to work with sap green or deep sap green, but for this fall color palette, I'm going to use some straight up raw umber. It's a really beautiful dark brown. And so far we've been working with a lot of these light, soft colors. So this brown is really going to bring in kind of a bold, contrasting color. And we will still be adding some more color for some of the filler leaves, but for now I just want to block in these main branches. Let's start with this area up here because that's where we have the most white space. Let me zoom you in a bit. I have some of that raw umber loaded up, and I'm going to start by adding simple brown leaves coming off of this red flower. Using the tip of my brush, I'm going to paint in a little stem, barely applying any pressure so it's just a little branch, and then I push down and lift back up to create a leaf. And I'm going to add a few little leaves coming off of it. I don't want this area to be too busy because the wreath is already pretty full and we're going to add more, but I like how this brown brings in that really woodsy, earthy vibe to the overall piece. Let's add another one coming off this way as well, starting with the stem and then just applying a little pressure. You can do 2 strokes if you want to create your leaf shape. Let's add some more off of here. I'm barely applying any pressure. So these strokes are very dainty and delicate. So there is the first little round of leaves. So we will be coming back and I'm going to add even more little orange flower buds and orange leaves coming off of it. But for now, I'm just going to work my way around the entire wreath, adding some little brown details. So for example, in this space, I barely have any room. So all I'm going to do is paint in this little tiny stem and add a couple little leaves. Very dainty. So that's it. It kind of looks like it's falling behind that flower petal. Let's add a few more. They don't all have to be this style either. So for example, if you want a couple of bigger leaves, I can add some coming out of this rose. I'm applying more pressure to create a bigger leaf. And let's have some coming out of the side as well. So I don't want to overdo it at this step because I do want to leave room for myself to add some more pops of color and flower buds throughout. So for now, all I'm doing is adding these little details, but leaving plenty of room to add even more. So you're more than welcome to add these wherever you like on your piece. You don't have to fill in every single white space, but you're just kind of bringing in this deep brown color in little accent areas throughout the wreath. And this is what's really going to bring this whole wreath together. Let's add a few more down here. And make sure you take a step back and look at it from afar every now and then to make sure you're not adding too much brown in one specific area. You do want to have it pretty spaced out so that we leave room for other elements. At this point, when you start adding stuff like this, it's really easy to go overboard and add too much. And it's always better to start by adding a little bit, and then you can always add more onto it. But if you start off too strong and you add tons of leaves and fillers and branches, you can't really take that away. So if it starts to be too messy, it's really hard to correct course. But if you start by adding some simple little leaves in a few areas like we're doing right now, if you find that later on you want to add more to it, you always have that option. Okay, so I went ahead and finished working my way around the wreath. So you can see I have a good amount of those brown leaves. They're not overpowering, but they do add that pop of deep earthiness to the piece. So at this point, I'm going to move back to my pencil. If you've done any of my wreath tutorials before, you know what's coming next. I always like to pencil in where I'm going to add my fillers. So working with a pencil just helps me to visualize where I want these little pops of color to go before committing with paint. So I can always erase my pencil marks if I want to, but I'm just going to work my way around, identifying where I can add some little flower buds. And these are going to be stems that are either going inwards towards the center of the wreath or a little bit more towards the outer edges of the paper. And that's going to help the wreath look more full and lush. So for example, we can add some flower buds coming off of this rose, for example. So let's say we have a little stem. I'm penciling this in, and that'll have a couple little buds coming off of that rose. We can also add a couple coming off of this leaf stem that we've already painted. I'm not drawing in flowers or leaves at this point. I'm just adding little lines for where I would potentially want to add some of these buds. Let's also have some coming out of this leaf area. And you can see as I work my way around, some of them are coming in towards the center. Some of them are working outwards like this one. So I'm kind of mixing it up, leaving a general amount of space between them. I don't want any areas that are too crammed with leaves and fillers. And I'm just taking my pencil and gently adding these in. And these will all be where I want to add in these little buds and fillers. And anytime I add these, I'm never having them go directly inwards or directly outwards. They're still following the general curve and circular shape of the wreath, but they are coming slightly off of that original line. So it's still in line with the general circular motion, but it's going slightly off of that line. And that is what is really going to help this wreath feel more full. Let's also have some coming off of this flower. As always, you're more than welcome to add these wherever you want. And also, you don't have to do this part in pencil if you don't want to. If you're confident and you just want to start adding them in, go for it. I just prefer to make sure that I'm happy with the direction of these before actually committing to the paint. So once you're done penciling in where you want these to be, you can use any color you want for these little pops of color. They're just going to be very simple little flower buds. I can show you in my example painting here where I was just kind of playing around with wreath designs. I have these little dainty orange buds. So I'm going to go with orange because I feel like it fits my color palette nicely. But if you want to go back to yellow, if you want to use your reddish purpley mixture, if you want to use a totally different color, have at it. Let me bring you in a little bit closer. So to create these buds, I'm using a very pigmented mixture of my orange. And all I'm going to do, you can see my little pencil marks here, all I'm doing is creating these tiny little egg shapes. They're not even perfect flower buds. They're not detailed at all. They're not overly complicated. I'm just adding these little buds, and you can see you can change things as you go. So for example, I penciled in only 2 stems, but I actually want to add 3. And I can do that when I go back in to add the stems. But for now, all I'm going to do is work my way around this wreath with my orange. It's a very bold orange, straight from the palette, which is going to bring a nice pop of color to the piece. And I'm working my way around, creating these very simple little egg-shaped flower buds. Once your buds are all filled in, we can go ahead and add the little stems. So if you want to use green, you can absolutely do that. I'm just going to stick with the very woodsy vibe, and I'll be using my same raw umber that I used for the first layer of leaves. And I'll start connecting these little dainty buds using the tip of my brush to create fine lines. All right, so taking another step back, you can see just adding those little pops of color and those stems that slightly go either in or outside of the wreath, it's already helping us fill out this wreath so much, and it's looking more lively and full. So we're going to do one last step, and that's adding some little touches of greenery and sprigs, kind of similar to what we just did, but adding even more to it. So again, let me show you this example one. I'm not following this exactly. This is just kind of testing things out, playing around with composition, but you can see I added these dainty little orange stems. They're very similar to the buds we just did, but they're almost like leaf stems, all in orange. I'm done with my brown, but it just helps make your wreath look even more full. This one is looking very dainty and delicate, but I want to beef it up a little bit. Again, feel free to use any colors you want. In my practice one, I used orange, but for this one, I'm feeling like I want to use some more of this cadmium yellow deep that I used for this flower. Let's bring you in a little bit closer again so I can show you my process. And instead of creating all these little sprigs, I'm going to create full-on stems. Again, if you want to, if you feel more comfortable, you can do this by first penciling in where you would want these to go. I almost always do this just so I feel more confident putting paint down on paper. Sometimes it can be a little bit scary if you just commit to it and add your stems without knowing exactly where they're going to go or how things will look. So you can do that if you'd like. But once we actually start adding these in, let me show you the process. It's pretty similar to what we've done, but I'm going to start with the tip of my brush and painting a simple little line and then pushing down and lifting back up to create a leaf stem. So it's very similar to the brown stems that we did, but each of these are going to be fully yellow. And you can see my pencil marks underneath, so if you do pencil things out before adding paint, just make sure you make it very light or you go over it with an eraser so that it doesn't show through. But this is what we're going to be doing throughout the entire wreath. I'll do another one in real time here, starting with the stem, pushing down, lifting back up. You can create various shapes and sizes of these leaves. You can have some that kind of come off to the side. So see how that one kind of droops down a little bit. But I'm just going to continue working my way around this wreath and filling in some of these white spaces. Not every white space, but just some of them. And again, I am still following the overall curve of the circle. I'm not having any go straight out to the side or off the edge of the paper. They're all still following this curve, but building out the wreath widthwise. So beware of your space as you do this step. Like I've mentioned in some of my other tutorials and this one, at this stage where you're adding the finishing touches, sometimes it's easy to go overboard, and then your piece ends up just looking messy and cluttered. And we definitely don't want that. We want these final steps to add to the wreath and make it look more lush and full and vibrant, but we don't want to just clutter it up just for the sake of adding things to it. So make sure as you do these parts, you're really stepping back, taking a look at your piece from afar, and making sure things aren't getting too crowded. So every now and then, pretty much after every little stem that I add, I zoom out and take a look from far away to make sure I'm not adding too much. This is probably as much as I would want to add. It's looking full, it's looking lush, but I still have some white spaces in between all these elements to really let each piece shine and breathe. Another thing I want to mention is you can play around with the direction of your wreath. This wreath, for example, it doesn't have one specific direction. You can see some of the leaves are going this way, some are going this way. Same with this one here. This is a great example. These leaves point to the right, these ones to the left. So it's a very multi-directional wreath. Sometimes I like to create wreaths that all flow in one direction, either clockwise or counterclockwise. And if you want to go that route, you want to make sure all your fillers and leaves are pointing in one direction. And that can create a really fun vibe, a really fun, unique overall look to your wreath. But for this one, I want to just keep it full and multi-directional. But that's just something to keep in mind. So as I add all these, for example, this little sprig, the leaves are pointing to the left, whereas this one is pointing to the right. So it's up to you, but as you paint more and more wreaths, you can really play around with different styles and see what you like best. So let's work our way around, adding in these final little stems. So that's going to be it for this fall wreath tutorial. I also just released a fall leaves tutorial that is a lot of fun. I will link that up here at the top. So if you want to continue with the fall theme, you can move on to that one next. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to my channel for more watercolor tutorials and studio vlogs. See you in the next one.